Hey there! I'm Chroma, and today we will be creating the movement for a top-down shooter. More specifically, we will be creating movement similar to the game The Binding of Isaac. This tutorial assumes just a little knowledge of Unity, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so to start things off, I've already gone ahead and made quite a few things in our scene here to help speed things along and make things look pretty, so we can get straight to the important part that is making our player move. Also, so we don't just have... I wanted to do more than just blocks this time. So, to start off though, before we get to that, I want to quickly just gloss over some of the things that we have here. So we'll do that real quickly. Now, in the project window, in the assets folder, we have 3 folders here. Scenes was here by default, and that's just the scene that we're currently in, although there's another folder in it that is the post-processing effects that you're seeing that's allowing this magic to happen. Actually, if I go and turn that off, this is what our scene currently looks like without it, which these colors do not look great, but with all these effects, it looks like this, which I'm pretty happy with, and I think it looks pretty cool. Now, as well, we have a scripts folder that has one script called player move that is currently empty because we're going to be making that very shortly to actually make our player move. Then we have a sprites folder that has 2 images here that is used for the actual art that we are seeing. Art, I say in massive quotation marks because it is just 2 blank images. So we have a square and a circle that are exactly as they sound. Now, with these, actually I'm just going to go and turn off the post-processing effects and just go with this for now. By just dragging these into our scene, we can have them as objects, and then we can change the color of them, which is why I made them white. And then, actually this one I can just tint it blue, and then ta-da, we have our player basically. Now, that is how we've made what's currently our player here that we're going to be setting up in just a moment, but right now it's just simply just a sprite renderer on this object, and then just shrinked down a little bit. Now our background is the exact same thing, it's just one of these squares that's also tinted and made really big. And then our walls are as well the same thing, just stretched out squares. Now this one, actually all 4 of these walls have box colliders on them for collision when we get our player to move, so that we aren't leaving the area that we want to be in kind of Binding of Isaac style of little rooms here. Now, with all of that out of the way, we can, well actually that's how our scene's set up. Now we want to set up like our camera. So our camera, and like all the fancy effects there, over in the actual camera view here, we have the background color that was just changed to this green. You can change any of these colors to whatever you want them. Now, the post-processing effects, it's a bit complicated, but I'll go over it real quickly. So, so over in the packages window here, you have to actually download the post-processing effects package if it's not installed by default. And you can do that by going up to Window, Package Manager, and then this window should come up. And then one of the things down here somewhere is going to be, all the way down at P, is going to be something called post-processing. So just going and installing it with install button that's right here. And then the folder should exist in this packages window folders somewhere. So with that done, then on the actual main camera, we can then go and add by going to add component, we can add something called post-processing layer, which adds something that looks like this. Yeah, and that's all we really need to do there. Then we need to make another empty game object, or an empty game object called, well, we can call it whatever we want. I called it post-processing. And then by adding a script called post-processing volume, we can then start fiddling with all of these settings to add things like the bloom and color grading and all of that stuff, vignette, all of these settings, which was literally just playing around with different settings and seeing what different things did to get this look that you're currently seeing here. I also tried adding grain, which looks pretty interesting. Actually, if I go into play mode real quick, so you can actually see it more so in action. Oh, right, we can't actually move the player yet, but it looks like this, which looks interesting, but I didn't want this to distract too much from the tutorial itself of getting the player to move. So that's all in all how that is done. Oh, one last thing is that this thing up here that says layer, you have to make sure that it's on a layer that you create called post-processing. That's the last thing there, I believe. I've covered everything there. Now, with that all said and done, let's get to the important thing of why you're here, which is getting the player to move. So, on our player game object here, in order to set it up, we're going to need a few things. Now, first we want it to get to collide with stuff when we get it to move, particularly the walls. We're going to add a box collider 2D in order to do that, which is exactly the same as what we had on our walls there. If you're making a 3D game, like a 3D top-down shooter of some kind, then you'd want just a normal box collider without the 2D on it, and everything that you're doing is going to be pretty much the same as I'm doing it, I think, just with 3D equivalents that should hopefully be similar enough. Now, in order to get it to move, we're going to be using physics. So, like everything that we use physics to move, we're going to be adding a rigid body, and because this is a 2D game, it'll be rigid body 2D, as I just said. And yeah, so now with this rigid body 2D, I don't think we need to change any of these settings here in this top part. Down here, one thing that we're going to want to do is, for our game thing here, because we have a circle, it doesn't really matter how it's rotated, but we're just going to freeze the rotation so that if you had an actual sprite here of like a face or whatever, as it's moving around, it's not going to spin, basically. But the position, that's fine, because we want it to move in whichever direction. Oh, one small thing I completely forgot is that gravity. We want to get rid of that, so I was mistaken in saying that we do need to change something. So yeah, make sure that gravity is 0 so that we aren't falling, because we're treating this like a top-down view of the world as opposed to like a platformer where it's a side view. Now, with that all said and done, we can finally get to coding to actually get this thing to move. So over in this scripts folder, I've made just the empty script called player move. We're going to be attaching it to our player in order to get it to move. So let's go open this up in Visual Studios. Huzzah. So with this opened up, we are now going to want to get it to move. So in order to get the player to move, particularly in a Binding of Isaac style, I went and did some research on specifically in that game how the movement was done, and I want to try and emulate it in a Unity style to the best of my ability. The first thing that we're going to want to do is get input from the player on the WASD keys to see if we've pressed those buttons. Now, particularly the way that we're going to do that, well, to just get input in general, we have input.getKey, and then the key that we want to test for. So in this case, let's say W. So we can have keycode.w, and then this is going to be a Boolean that if it's true, then like it's going to be true when the player is pressing W, basically. So this is how we're going to be getting input for the most part. Now, usually if you want to just test something with input, we can go if that, then in here code will run if we're pressing this button. However, I want to go and actually store this in a variable, and I'll explain why in a second when we get there. So we're actually up at the top. We're going to make a private, if I can spell, private Boolean, and we're going to call this, how about input up? I'll just put a U there, and we're going to want to get input from WASD, so we're going to need 4 things. So I'm actually just going to make 4 of these, and this is going to be input down, input left, and input right. So with these, at the beginning of our update function, we're going to want to set these values, and we're going to do that by just going input u equals input.getKey keycode.w. And then this will then, if I can hit the right buttons, this Boolean will then be true or false, depending on if we hit W. And then we're going to want to do quickly the same things for our other buttons. So input down, left, and right are equal to whether or not we're currently pressing W, S, A, and D. All right, so now that we have our input, we're going to want to test which of these buttons that we've hit to actually determine which way we want to move in. Now, in order to then save what direction that we want to move in, we're going to make another variable up here that is going to be a vector2, and we're just going to call it dir for direction, basically. Now, with that, we're going to want to then test which buttons we're hitting and then change our direction based on that. So we're going to go and test if we've hit the W key. So we're going to start with our up and down movement. It's going input U. Oh, hold on. So if we've hit the U or the U input or hitting W, then we're going to want to set, in this case, the direction. We're going to be dealing with the Y component of it, because that's the Y is the up and down, the X will be the left and right. And we're just going to set it to 2, 1. And then if we, or not else, if we've hit the S key, so input down, then we are going to want to set dir.y to -1, like so. And then actually we'll just focus on this for a minute and get this to work, and then we'll add in the parts for the moving left and moving right in just a minute. So in order to use these directions to actually move our player in those directions, we're going to be setting the velocity of our player here. Now, in order to get access to the velocity with the physics that we want to do, we're going to be getting a reference to the rigid body component that we made on our player. So we're going to go and make a new variable that is a private rigid body. Now, specifically rigid body 2D, because we're dealing with 2D stuff here. The 2D would be not there if we were doing 3D stuff. Now, with having the rigid body, we actually have to get a reference to it, the actual component that should be on the same game object as this script here. So then in our start function, we can just go rigid body equals get component rigid body 2D, and then typing it exactly like this with these angled brackets and curved brackets like that. Now that we have the rigid body component down here, we can go rigid body dot velocity is equal to basically our direction vector. So this would allow us to move up and down. Now we're also going to want to control speed. So we're actually just going to make another variable that's actually going to be up here. It's going to be public, and we're just going to make a float that we're going to call move speed. And this will then just be the speed that we move at. And then we're just going to multiply that in here. So very basically, this is going to allow our player to move. So going back into Unity and waiting for things to load in, or to compile, if I want to use the proper terminology. So going back to our player, we can then just drag the player move script onto our player move, which actually can be a bit finicky, I should explain, because if you try to just drag it on, it won't do it right away. Or like, it might not do it properly. You have to kind of go beneath in this like add component area, which can be a little finicky. Or just going to add component and typing player move, and it should appear. So now we have our player move script here. And I'm going to set the speed to, I don't know, something like 10. That might be too much or too little. I'm not sure. So starting this in play mode then. Oh, that's perfect. All right, so now we can see that we can move, sort of. We're moving up and down, but if I let go of the buttons, we aren't stopping to move, and we can't move in any other direction, and it's a very fixed speed. In the Binding of Isaac, the speed is a little more slippery, but not too much. So like when we're moving different directions, there's a little bit of slipperiness to it, pretty much. So we're going to want to be making that. So back over to our code. Let's do more with this, shall we? So first of all, I want to go and make the left and right movement, since it's going to be basically the same thing, by just copying this code and putting it down here, replacing this for a left and a right, and then changing the X values of these directions. Then that should do the same. No. I was about to say they'll do the same thing, but one slight change is that if we're moving left, we'll want to set this to -1, and if we're moving right, we want this to be +1, just with the directions that we want to be moving. Otherwise, we'd have like reversed controls. So then another thing that we could add is if we want to stop when we let go of the buttons, we could just go else if we're not pressing, or so we go, how do I want to word this? So if we press up, then make it 1. Otherwise, if we hit down, make it -1. Otherwise, so if we haven't pressed either of them, then set dir.y to 0, and that would make us stop moving. However, this is not how the Binding of Isaac does it, because this would also have the effect of if we're hitting both up and down at the same time, it would prioritize moving up in this case. Although the Binding of Isaac does, if you're hitting both buttons, then you don't move, I believe. So we want to do that. Well, I mean, we don't have to copy it exactly, but I'm going to because I can. So, yeah. And then another thing is when we stop moving, we don't want to come to a complete stop by just setting it to 0. We want to sort of slowly stop a little bit. So, yeah, this is where our making these variables come into play, because we're going to be using them in more than one place. So it's just better to store them and use them multiple times. Yeah. All right. So what we're going to want to do here is if we are not pressing either up or down, so if we're not pressing either of them, then we want to stop moving. So we can go we have another if statement here that's basically if input u input u, or, no, and input down, and putting exclamation marks beside them so that they're not. So basically, if we're not pressing the up key, the W key, and we're not pressing the S key, that means we're not wanting to move in either of those directions. So if we aren't doing that, then we are going to go dir.y, and we're just going to divide it by 2, basically, so that it keeps halving, so that it slows us down a little bit. Sorry, equals dir.y divided by 2. Divided by 2. There we go. So then this will half it every time we're not pressing it. And then if we are not doing that, if that's not the case, then we're going to put an else statement around all of this. Now, additionally, with what I just said a second ago of how if we're pressing both keys, we also want to not move in those directions, we can just copy this and put it in the same if statement here by going like this. Okay, so basically now what this says is if we're pressing up and we're pressing down, or if we're not pressing up and we're not pressing down, then we want to stop moving in that direction. So then keep halving the speed. And then you can also mess with this number to make it different values if you want to stop at different speeds. Like if you want it to be a slower stop, you could make this a really small number by just going like 1.1, and you have to put an F if it's a decimal. And yeah, you'd stop a lot slower, but we're gonna go with just a 2 because that will work. Now, with that being done, we're gonna want to go down here and do the same thing for the left and right controls. So basically the same thing with L's and R's and L's and R's. And then we also want to make sure to change dir.y to dir.x because down here we are dealing with the x components of them. And then also squiggly bracket on the other end of this else statement. So now that should allow us to move in both directions, but we're not done just yet. Whoop, hold on, this one. Yeah, we're not done just yet. There's gonna be a little bit more that we want to do. But going into this, then huzzah, we are moving. And we're not slowing down like that much, but we will in a moment when we add some more stuff. So, but yeah, we're moving in all 4 directions, which is the main thing that we want. So that's pretty cool. So here we have basic top-down shooter movement, but we're going to be going one step further than that. So going back to our code, if I can open up the right one, okay, so to start off, one thing I actually didn't mention that I should have, because we're going to want to deal with that first, is with the way that we are currently moving, if we are moving like up and down versus if we're moving diagonal, do you notice how we're kind of moving faster towards the diagonal than just up and down? That's something that we're going to want to fix. And that is because if we are moving, let's say up, we're moving with the speed of 1, we'll call it. And if we're moving down, it's the speed of 1. If we're moving up with a speed of 1 and we're moving to the right with a speed of 1, if we are going in this diagonal direction, we're not going this way at a speed of 1. It'd be, we're going up by 1 and right by 1, and that's being like added. I'm trying to find the right terminology to explain this simply, but we're going to want to basically deal with that to make it so that whatever direction we're moving in, we're moving that way with a speed of 1. So how we're going to go and do that is over in our code. There we go. Okay. Over in our code, we're going to want to just add a thing that says if the direction, this direction variable that we have, if the magnitude of it, which is going to be that length in whichever direction that it's going in, if it's greater than 1, then we're going to want to make it so that it only has a length of 1. And we can do that by just saying dir equals dir.normalized. And then with a semicolon at the end. Then this will make it so that it has a, it won't go beyond 1. We do want it to go less than 1 sometimes up here when we are slowing down. So we don't want it to always be normalized, only if it's greater than 1, not less than 1. So that will help with that a little bit. Now, lastly, we are close to being done here. Yes, okay. Last thing that we want to do to move slower or smoother and have more of that slipperiness, rather than just directly setting the velocity to this direction times the move speed, we want it to slowly go from our current velocity to this new speed by a certain amount. Now, how we can do that is using a function called vector2.lerp, which stands for linear interpolation. So with this, we're going to go vector2.lerp, rigidbody.velocity, comma, this new velocity that we want to set it to, comma, and then a kind of a smoothing amount. And actually, we're going to just go up here and make a new variable to put there. That's going to be a public float. We're going to call it smoothing. Ta-da. And then we can just put that variable in here. One also little thing is that because we're dealing with physics, we're just going to want to change the name of update to fixed update, which basically is just better for physics. It runs at a more consistent frame rate that allows physics to be smoother. Anyways, back over into Unity now. We now have this other variable here for smoothing, and we're going to want to set that to, I believe, 0.2 will be good. Yeah. Now, going into play mode, let's see how this looks. Aha. And now, as we can see, I can also turn off the post-processing so it's more, it looks clearer, I guess. So, as you can see, we have movement now. And not just movement, but we have this kind of sliding effect that as we turn around, there's just a little bit of slide. Not too much, because slippery controls can be bad unless that's the type of, unless that's like a point of the game that you're trying to design where it is meant to be super slippery. But usually for games like this, top-down shooters where you need a lot of precision, too much slipperiness can be a bad thing. But this seems to work just fine. We can also still, if we want to, we can still go and mess with these numbers even more. If you made it higher, 0.8, you're going to get less of that smoothing amount. So, or you're going to get less of that, yeah, smoothness. So it'll be more stopping faster, basically. But by making it smaller, we have more of that slide, which is good. And then also if we press both buttons, we don't move in either of those directions. So, huzzah! Oh, actually, I'm just going to go and turn this back on because it looks nicer. Yeah. So, with all of that, we now have the movement for a top-down shooter. So, that basically brings us to the end of this tutorial, and I hope you found it helpful and all of that. Now, I could also go and make the, I guess, shooting, because usually for this type of game, if you're making a top-down shooter, the other half of this of the movement is making the shooting. So I'll probably make that at some point as well, if y'all want to see it. As well, if I want to do some more Binding of Isaac related stuff, just because the movement of the camera, in terms of just, not just following the player, but the way that that type of camera operates, where it'll, when you go to a different room, it'll kind of like pan over by a specific amount. I could go and make something like that as well. Tell me what you want to see, and I will make it, because I hopefully can. But yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot I end these with a challenge. So I challenge you to make something with this. Even without the shooting, make some kind of little game where you have to like move around and maybe dodge obstacles of some kind or something like that. Another thing you can do, if you want a simple camera follow thing, if you just drag the camera under the player and then go into play mode in a second, that's an easy way to just get the camera to follow along with the player so you can move through larger environments and all that. So yeah, my challenge to you is to do that and make a thing that, make a bit of a level being able to move around like this. So that'll do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.